Hey there, it's Mohammed from the Reconfigured podcast. This is going to be a different kind of podcast. It's more of an announcement than it is an episode with a guest. And I'm just going to talk in a very free form matter, much more than just a script and following some rules. So I'm just going to be speaking what's on my mind. This is an announcement for something that I just want to say about regarding the podcast and about two projects that I'm currently working on. So it's more of an announcement for what will be happen for the podcast and those two projects. As for the podcast, nothing's going to change. There's still a list of people who's going to come up as guests on the podcast. Everything's working smoothly. But now the podcast is going to be part of the first project that I'm going to be working on. It's that I'm merging the podcast and my blog under the Reconfigured naming. It's still going to be the Reconfigured podcast. Nothing's going to change. The name is still the same. You're still going to be listening to the same people. You're going to be listening to the same voice that you're hearing right now, but just we're going to get guests on the pod. But now instead of just being under the Reconfigured podcast under my name, which was registered under my name actually, it's going to be registered under a branding name, which is Reconfigured. The reason why I chose this is because a lot of people used to reference the podcast as Reconfigured, not the Reconfigured podcast, which was totally fine. I'm okay with this. But then people be like, okay, but what if you actually put a blog for the podcast so that you can announce, like, let's say, clips for the podcast? You can cut episodes and you can write articles regarding this topic and you can clip it to, let's say, a clip about project management, or let's say handling a team. You would get clips from episodes that you've done, you put them as a blog post, and then you have a blog with a reference to the podcast. I kind of like this, and I thought about it for quite some time. And I also thought about doing collaborative blog post, technical collaborative blog post, if going to be specific, similar to how I do for the podcast. And it will start to make sense when I will talk about what I did for the podcast. It will start to make sense for the blog, and it will start to make much more sense for the rebranding. So the podcast started as an experiment where I posted it on Polywork saying, hey, I am giving you a space so you can talk about your experience. If you're interested to talk about your extended experience, just shoot a message and we'll do a research. I'll write some questions. And if you like the questions, we'll do an episode. And it worked out really good. A lot of people liked the episodes. They start applying to the podcast. A lot of people who I didn't expect applied to the podcast. Some of them, we got them as guests. And I'm very grateful for that. Then someone suggested me and he told me, like, hey, Muhammad, you're getting people on the podcast. Some of those podcasts are kind of big. Like, not a lot of people are fancy of listening to 1 hour or 2 hour episode. There is even a 3.5 hour episode on the podcast, which is quite impressive if you're doing a podcast. But for regular people who would like to hear glimpses of the podcast, how about if you can clip the podcast into smaller episodes? And you would write an article explaining and you would reference the clips. And I was like, okay, I'm quite interested in this. But the problem is that the podcast is still under my name. And it's totally fine since I'm doing the podcast on my own, which is quite normal. So it's registered under my name, which is Technology, which is the combination of my family name, Kalaji, and technology, which is totally fine. But what if I actually wanted to do collaborative blog posts? But why would I want to do collaborative blog posts? So I wanted to write technical blog posts, and I would love to get people to curate the blog posts that I'm writing. And I don't mind getting guest blog posts to be written on the blog, but I have to curate them as well. The problem is that with the blogging sphere, there's a lot of content being thrown on the internet without being checked if it's legit or not, but just people are posting them to farm views. So let's say a well-reputed site, I'm not going to name any kind of website, you just know them. Any technical person would know those kind of websites, is that the people who post there, sometimes they just copy from other websites. They will plagiarize the content. They would copy something just so they can farm views. And when you post a lot, you start to get a decent amount of activity on those blogs and you get recommended. So instead of posting 5 good articles, you're posting 1 good article and you're posting 5 bad articles, but you're tricking the algorithm to make you think, hey, I'm posting a lot, so I'm getting some heat. And the algorithm will be like, hey, this guy is posting a good amount of content and people are reacting to it. Whether the comments are good or bad, people are acting with the blog posts, so now he's getting shown up. The problem is the content is not curated. Why this is a problem? Well, if let's say, for example, you're interested in a specific topic and you want to learn about a specific topic and you go to that blog site to learn about this topic, high chance you're going to find 6 authors writing the exact same blog post because they copy it from each other and the sources might be outdated. How do you make sure that this is up to date? If you ask the author that he wrote this, he'd be like, "Oh, I'm gonna write it in a different blog post. Don't worry," and it's not curated. And he might have actually copied it from the main source that he actually copied it from the beginning, and he's waiting for that person who actually did the work to post about this. But what if I actually wrote articles that are checked, working, and they're high quality? But let's add to the mix. What about if someone else is interested to do this, but they needed a platform where it's shown to be a legit platform and not a place that is notoriously known for people copy and pasting, a platform that is starting out as new, where you can submit a form, you get your blog post checked by someone who's been in the tech field, we curate it, we make sure that it's a working every single thing, and we keep up to date with what's currently going on and post it, and we're going to provide quality content. So having a blog with collaborative working is something that's quite interesting, and we don't see that much often. We rarely see articles written between developers or any kind of content creator that is like, let's say, a guest article, but it's a curated guest article. Usually you would find this in, let's say, news websites. So they would bring someone who's outside of a news company to write an article, but it's going to be heavily edited by an editor within the company, which is totally fine. But we've never seen this in the tech space. And the reason why it's because we're used to the idea of, oh, okay, just post on the blog, create a blog. It's very easy to create a blog post and all of that. But some of the content is not being tested or checked if it's not plagiarized. And it's very difficult to check if something is plagiarized or not. It's not that easy. So why would I want to do this kind of thing? Because I'm kind of frustrated by how writing blogs nowadays, there's no essential value of writing a blog post other than the fact we're just getting views, and you would just boast around saying, oh, I got, let's say, 100,000 views in a month. I will tell you my way. And they would post it on, let's say, on Twitter and other platforms on social media just so they can get attention, so that other people would be like, oh, if we did the same, then we would actually get this kind of views. So it's no longer about writing quality content, but it's about just writing content, copying content, and just plagiarizing to the point just so you can get views. You can farm views, and if you're having, let's say, something like Google AdSense, you would start to make money out of it. So people will be like, oh, this is how you can make $1,000 a month from Google AdSense by writing blog posts. And if you check the quality of the blog posts, they're not that good. So as a software developer who wants to check, either I have to dig deep between Stack Overflow, or I need to search between those blog posts that I just want to learn about a specific topic, or if someone actually was good enough to come up with a platform that does quality content. And this is what's going to happen. The problem is, I cannot do that on my personal blog. The reason why, it's because it's more like claiming the blog post as my own, even though I might be doing it for serving the community. So let's take this from a different perspective. Imagine if you want to write a blog post and you want it to be curated, but the person who posted it on their own personal blog. That doesn't sound right. Actually, it sounds like I ripped off your work and I said, hey, I got this guest person on my blog. Read it. Okay, but when you go to the website, you're going to go to my personal website and you're going to think that I wrote the article and you were just a guest post. Nobody is going to pick up the details and saying like, oh, this is written, let's say, by Joe. No, you're just going to come up and say, no, this is Technology's website. So this is built by Muhammad Kalaji. So this is a Muhammad Kalaji's article, but he got someone to write it with him. Instead of saying, oh, this is under a brand, and this brand is hosting reputable blog posts and content, whether it's podcast or blogs. And Joe wrote this article on this website, which is going to be Reconfigured. So the whole project of rebranding the podcast and the blog is to create a media outlet that is going to post quality content. The Reconfigured podcast brings people from different professional fields to talk about their experience, which is going to be more like an honest, open discussion with a guest so they can talk about their experience freely. We've been doing it for quite some time. People like the episodes, and we're going to stick on doing that for a very long time. But I'm just not going to stick to tech mostly because there are some interesting people from non-technical backgrounds that are quite interesting to talk on the podcast. And I did experiment with two people. I got a project manager and I got a digital, if I'm going to say this, we got a digital communications and a project manager, which is something that is quite interesting when doing a podcast, because usually I used to do it as just a tech podcast. I'm still going to keep on doing tech podcasts, but we're going to do marketing, digital. I was going to say this, not just like anything that's on the digital world, whether it's marketing or project management or any of those kind of things, can be accepted as long as the content and the person who's providing value brings back to the community. It's totally fine. As for the blogs, I always wanted to write blog posts, and I wanted to write quality blog posts. So I don't mind writing 1 or 2 articles, but I want to write a proper 1 to 2 articles, not 17 articles. And I would say, this is how you do X, and you would find there are 17 or 20 blog posts that talk about the exact same thing. But rather, I want to talk about a complex architecture that I did at work that might help someone. Because if I face with this kind of issue and I didn't find any documentation, I have to create this from my own, then probably someone else might be facing with the same issue, which makes total sense. The problem is I cannot claim it as my own. Well, if I'm writing the blog post, then yes, I can claim it on my own. But what if I want to bring people on as collaborators for the blog? Then it's not fair for me to just put everything under my name and claim it as mine, even though someone else might be doing the job, which is quite unfair. So this is the first project, which is doing a media outlet called Reconfigured. It's going to be available at reconfigured.co. I'm still developing a basic website for it, still working on it, but it's going to be like an integration with the podcast as well. So I might write some articles that are referenced from the podcast. I might bring guest people to write articles, technical articles about architecture or something else. So I'm going to give like an example. Maybe we could get someone from AWS to write about a tough architecture. Maybe we can get someone from let's say, a big reputable company to talk about a product that's well known in the developer space, and much more. As for the second project that I'm currently working on, I'm working on my own startup actually. And I think I'm doing this finally. I'm doing my own startup. I'm still going to be working my regular 9 to 5 job, but I'm just going to do it as a side business. I'll be discussing more about what the company is and all of that, but I've always wanted to do a startup. And it took me some time to gain some experience and to take the decision of saying, okay, this is something that I want to do in the future. It is something that's quite unique and it's quite different than how usually things used to work. And I'm happy to take that kind of decision. But I know it's going to be a long way. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some patience. And I'm willing to do this in the near future. I'm not going to discuss what the company's name is and what's going to do exactly in details in this episode, but rather I'm going to announce it soon later on. But just keep in mind that also the presence of the company is going to be impacted within the blog and the podcast. So usually if you were a good listener of the podcast, you would find out that I used to say I'm an AWS community builder, and I used to say I'm also a software developer at a company. Now, after building my own startup, I might reference myself to being the founder of the startup as well. And I might pitch in my own company inside as, I'm going to say this, I might shamelessly plug my startup in some of the episodes. Shameless plug. It's totally, I'm not going to say it's totally fine at some level, but I'm just like shamelessly plug it because it's my own thing. I might add it like an advertisement at the beginning. I don't know. I still haven't taken a full decision on this. I'm saying this in a free format. don't want to do something that might revolt the viewers on this. So I'm just experimenting with certain things. But to recap on what's going on in a simple recap, the podcast is still going to stay the same, but it's going to be rebranded under the Reconfigured naming. I'm recreating the blog from scratch, and I'm going to write quality content. I'm going to reference some parts from the podcast on the blog, and I'm going to bring guest writers to write on the blog, claiming the articles to be theirs, and I would be just curating the content to make sure that it's working and it's performing as expected rather than just copy pasting. So it's more about creating quality podcasts, quality blog posts, but under a media outlet, which is called Reconfigured, so that it would be fair. But also there's something that I haven't discussed about the media outlet as well, which is, I just remembered about this right now. The podcast received a decent amount of people who are interested to do collaborations. And those are companies willing to do advertisement and sponsorships for the podcast. This is quite interesting because I tried doing partnerships in the past. I did land some decent, I'm going to say, partnerships, but we haven't disclosed them publicly to the pod. But now I'm open to do collaborations with people, not just with people, with companies as well, if they want to sponsor the podcast. So under the Reconfigured naming on, let's say, the website, which is called reconfigured.co, this is going to be like a long-term kind of thing, and it's going to take some time for me to build, but I'm just going to state from now. On the Reconfigured website, I'm going to create a partner portal where if someone wants to apply as a partner, they can keep track on what episode the advertisement is posted on, and we can negotiate a deal. And if someone is interested to be sponsored on the podcast and they're willing to provide value to the guests, to myself, and to the audience by giving, let's say, a discount code for their service, they might give us money as a way for just doing advertisement and much more. I haven't decided on how the mechanism it's going to be. we're going to experiment with some of those collaborations with those companies, and we'll see how things will go. But we'll create a portal and say, hey, your advertisement appeared on this episode, this blog post, and XYZ. This is how much you have to pay, or this is how much you have to provide. We haven't decided on how the full mechanism is going to be. I'm still experimenting with this, so bear with me on this. And the startup that I'm currently working on, which is a different entity than the Reconfigured media outlet. So to give a final recap, the podcast is still going to stay the same. I'm creating a media outlet called Reconfigured, which is going to be available on reconfigured.co. It will host a podcast and a blog post and blogs and featured blog posts by people. I'm going to be creating a partner portal for if, let's say, a company wants to collaborate with us or any of that in case we want to do something on a media level. And I'm working on my own startup in the future, which I will be announcing privately later on. That's my announcement. That's what I got. So it's just 2 projects that I'm currently working on, and I'm just gonna keep on focusing on doing that for quite some time. It took me some time to rethink about doing this kind of episode because some people might not like this. Some people might say why he's doing this. But I think it's just being open to the public about what I'm going to do to see how the reaction would be. Because some people would say like, no, I like the podcast to be like a personal podcast because the personal branding fits much more better than doing it as a corporate branding, which starts to make more sense. But I'm experimenting with this. I'm going to see where it's going to head, and we will see how things are going to go. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episodes.